Hiya folks, welcome back to the Small Business Toolbox. One of the most stressful things that can happen to any business is for it to be compliance checked under an HMRC audit. And in part one, I explained all of the questions that HMRC asked me as part of a compliance check. And today, in part two, I'm going to tell you what all of my responses to HMRC were, how long the whole thing dragged out for, and whether or not I got in trouble at the end of it. Let's crack on, and I will tell you the information that I sent back to them. So there's quite a lot to cover off here, so I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can physically get through it. But if you remember, there was kind of two phases of questions. There was the initial batch of quite simple questions, and then it went into quite in-depth questions later on. The first 4 or 5 questions were kind of covered off by the questions that they asked later on in the audit. So I can kind of skip over the first few where they'd said the level of income as a sole trader, expenses claimed against income, capital allowances claimed, lack of bank interest, and then we'll get to question number 5, which is the description of this business and the reason for the low turnover. So remember, this is just part of my very initial response to HMRC. I'm not giving them very much detail here because I don't really know how much they want to dig into things. So I've basically said that the Andy Mac Drums business covers private drum lessons, playing professionally as a gigging drummer, and obviously in all of this I'm providing links to my website so they can dig into it and they can actually verify that it was a legitimate business. So hopefully from that they've got a good enough understanding of where income is coming from. Question number 6, where they said reasons why the losses should be considered as allowable expenses. I didn't really understand that question, so I just ignored it. Then question 7, explanation of business expenses. So all I did, I literally went into my Excel spreadsheet for this business and I filtered it by the tax year. I didn't provide copies of the receipts at this stage. All I did was provide them a full list of every business expense that I had. So I had a receipt ID, who the payee was, what the item was, some notes just to describe what it was for, basically. I filtered it by OPEX and CAPEX, but as I say, with cash basis, you don't really need to bother doing that anymore. And then I had the amount and date for each one, and obviously at the end of all this, I had a total that I gave them as well. So they already had that total from my tax returns, so it's not news to them. Then they asked for copies of receipts and invoices for the amounts claimed, and I thought that was a little bit unusual at this stage to ask for a copy of every single physical receipt. I mean, if you get audited, it's very possible that they may ask for that from you, but basically what I did at this stage, I just kind of brushed over that question. I'd sent them the full breakdown of everything, and I figured, if they want more detail, they can get back to me. And plus, I'd spoken to them on the phone as well. I think I might have clarified that point on the phone when I spoke to them and said, look, are you wanting us to literally send you a box of receipts, or can I send you a list and then you can tell us which ones you want to see? Because, you're talking about like parking receipts for £1.20 and stuff like that. So I figured I'd give them a list, put the ball back in their court. Then we got onto the whole bank interest question, which, if you remember, I think this was the red flag that triggered the investigation in the first place, because I told my accountant about bank interest that I'd received, but he forgot to put it on my tax return, and basically we ended up with a gap in the records where the year before I'd declared bank interest and the year after I declared bank interest, but for this particular tax year the accountant forgot to put it on and no interest was declared. So if we skip forward onto question 10, it kind of covers off this one as well, the source of funds for the bank interest. There was no source of funds. The funds were already there. The funds were there the year before and the year after, and it's just they weren't on the tax return. It doesn't make any difference because I'd already paid tax on the interest anyway. I wasn't being paid gross interest, so it made no difference anyway. And I basically provided this breakdown of all of my income. So I had some PAYE income that year and self-employment income, and interest, and I showed the tax deducted and all that sort of thing, and it basically made it pretty obvious to HMRC that that whole area just wasn't even worth looking into. It was clearly an oversight on the tax return. I hadn't withheld any tax. I'd paid tax on my savings interest. It was a total non-issue. So then about a month went past, and then HMRC got back to me with much more detailed questions. And the first question was, where did business income originate from? So to get through this whole phase 2 section, I put together a 2-page response, and it was quite a succinct response, but it answered every single question that they asked me. But just so you get an idea of how much detail I'm putting into this, over the course of the next 20 questions, it was about 2 pages of A4, plus copies of receipts and all that. Well, I'll come to that. So, where did business income originate from? And what I said was, in the 2012-13 tax year, I made however much from teaching drums and however much from playing professionally. And in the following tax year, this figure increased significantly as a result of the work put in the earlier tax year, and it was forecast to increase again in the subsequent tax year. So it kind of proved, I could have drawn a graph and shown the business kind of running at a loss in the early years, and then it starting to turn profitable, and basically just illustrating the growth of the business, because I was getting audited when the business was kind of at maybe this kind of stage here. But I could clearly demonstrate that the business was growing and it was financially viable. It's just I got audited while it was making a loss. They can't complain about that, because there's plenty big companies who basically run making a loss like more or less forever. Amazon. Then, how many drum lessons did I give? I told them how many drum lessons I gave. How many times did I play drums professionally in a band? I told them how many times I played drums professionally in a band. With both of these, I could have extrapolated that out and literally given them a list of every single pupil that I taught, and when I taught them, and how long each lesson was for, and how much I made from each lesson, and every gig I did, and where the gig was. I had that information, but they didn't ask for it. Don't provide information they're not asking for. Question 14. How much money have I made from my online drumming website in that tax year? Since the online business was being set up, it made however much. Probably not very much. Question 15 is quite a big one. Why do I think it's a real business? At the end of the day, it's illustrated by that graph that I showed you earlier, which I could have provided them something like that, but they didn't ask for it. But if things started to drag on, I could have provided that as part of the investigation. But what I ended up saying was, the business is running more or less to plan. The intention was always to invest significantly in the business while I still had the safety net of full-time employment. Significant effort was put in the early days to realise a profit. This took longer than expected, however, the business is now profitable. Please also understand that making money from music is not easy, blah, 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 sob story, violins, but it's true. There was an enormous amount of groundwork needed to kind of turn that side of the business into a profitable thing. I've also mentioned to keep costs down. I've done all the web development work and video production work myself. The cost to create the website, blah, blah, blah. So basically what I'm saying is the expenses would have been way, way higher had I paid for someone to do my websites for me, or had I paid for a company to do video production work for me. So really, in the scheme of things, the costs weren't that high. Question 16. Which parts of the business generated income in the early years? Drum teaching. Question 17 was, when did the business actually start trading? Or what they gave me a date from way, way earlier, before the tax investigation, or before this tax year that is getting investigated. And they said, was it still getting set up at that date, or did it start trading? And I just basically said, that's when I started getting the business set up. And it's also when I started building a commercial teaching studio in my house, for which I claimed no tax relief on the expenses of doing that, which I probably should have done. Question 18. How much time did I spend running the business? I've told them it was 40 hours a week, and it was way more than that. It was every waking hour. I always think that's a bit of an odd question, Question 19, please provide a copy of the mileage log for all business travel, which I did. And it was literally just a scan of my handwritten scroll of a mileage log. It was several pages long, and it showed, again, I'll try and zoom in on this, but there's not much to it. It just showed the date and the destination or the purpose. So I generally try and show at least a postcode or enough information that you could kind of backtrack where you went, how many miles you travelled. That was really all there was to it. Question 20, details of why I claimed for business travel when the turnover was so low. Again, bit of an odd question really, because there's nothing to say that you can only claim business mileage when you have a high turnover. So I kind of just brushed over that one. Question 21, specific details about an individual trip that they asked about. I explained what that trip was. It was to buy some equipment and also check out some potential gig venues. Question 22, why did a drum teacher need to pay for drum lessons? And I explained that as succinctly as I could. I've been playing drums for 28 years. However, in order to teach more advanced students, I needed to bring my own playing up to a suitable standard, and top-up lessons are an ongoing business expense. Nothing wrong with that at all. Question 23, why did I claim for costs of rehearsals with a very low income? This was quite an interesting one because I spotted a couple of mistakes on my tax return at this point, and I suddenly panicked because I had claimed for the full value of the band rehearsals and just completely failed to account for the fact that the costs were split between all of the band members, so I should have only claimed for a quarter of that or whatever. But what I did also notice is that I accidentally missed off my accountancy fees from the expense list, and the accountancy fees were way more than the band rehearsal fees. So I just said, can this be added onto my 2013-14 return? They didn't reply to that question, surprisingly enough. Question 25, detailed breakdown of costs relating to using my home as an office or teaching space. This is probably a big one for a lot of you if you work from home. So this is what I've said. See attached breakdown, which I'll show you in a minute. They asked for floor areas and all sorts of things, and I wasn't about to go to a house that I used to live in and knock on the door to ask them to measure up the rooms. So I just said I didn't have that information. The rooms in question were dedicated to the business and were used 100% for business purposes. Please note that the weighting applied was on the advice of my accountant, who said it should be based on a proportion of the number of bedrooms in the property. I still have no clue whether or not that is correct, but they didn't question it. Here's a breakdown that I provided for them. So I basically listed gas and electric, water, council tax, house insurance, telephones and mobile phones. I told them who the supplier was. I told them how much the total bill was over that period of time. And then I applied a weighting. For 4 months, I was in a 5-bedroom house with 1 room dedicated to teaching drums. And for 8 months, I was in a 4-bedroom house with 2 rooms dedicated to teaching drums and video production. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of it. I literally turned our dining room into a drum video production suite. Anyway, based on that, I claimed 25% of my household bills, or these household bills. I figured that seems reasonable to me. The accountant kind of thought that was reasonable. I would love to know in the comments what you've been told by your accountant as to what you can claim. But at the end of the day, this is the information I provided to HMRC as part of the audit, and they didn't question it. All I would say is, please don't consider this as being set in stone, because there really is no right and wrong answer. That's the figures I used, and it survived audit. And then finally, question 29, please provide copies of invoices and receipts for all purchases over £250. So this was a bit more of a sensible approach to asking for copies of receipts. They set a threshold of £250. And this is why I'm saying, don't volunteer information that they're not asking for, because you might just be creating extra work for yourself. And as it was, they came back and only wanted copies of receipts for everything over £250. And guess what? I provided copies of receipts for all purchases over £250. And here are some of them. I literally just took photos of them and sent the photos of the receipts back, and they were happy enough with that. Obviously, here's the number that correlates to the list of expenses, but you can see where I've numbered each one, and this shows all the details that HMRC need to know. Once again, another shop that no longer exists in that location. And that was that. I sent all the information back to them that they asked for, or most of it anyway. I'm sure you're dying to know what happened next. Was I in the clear, or did I end up behind bars for tax evasion? Well, all I can tell you is that there was a lot of sleepless nights. So bearing in mind that they first got in touch with me on the 1st of August 2014, I submitted my first response to them on the 21st of August, and then I submitted my second response on the 29th of September. And then I got this letter. And this came through on the 28th of October 2014, so almost 3 months this dragged on for. And it says, information about our check of your self-assessment tax return. I have now completed my check of your return. This letter is a closure notice issued under Section 28A of the Taxes Management Act of 1970. And they went on to say, my conclusion, I've accepted that you did commence self-employment on the date given. Although the expenses are high, I have accepted them as claimed. However, please note, if you continue to incur losses, the position may be reviewed again. I have amended your return to show the bank interest received, but this doesn't affect your tax liability. If you have any questions or need any more information, please phone me on the number shown at the top of this letter. So that was it. I was in the clear. My tax return was all fine. And to be fair on HMRC, they were really helpful through the whole process. I think they understand from a small business perspective that it is a really stressful time, but it's just something that happens. It's something you need to get through. And if you remember, I was owed a little bit of tax back from this tax return. And literally about a week later, a cheque turned up in the post from HMRC. So there you go, folks. In a nutshell, don't panic. But this is why you need to keep good accounting records. Because if HMRC see you kind of dithering about trying to get information and you're struggling to answer the questions that they've asked you, that is when they're more likely to dig deeper and deeper into your tax affairs. If you get back to them quickly and provide all the proof that they've asked for, copies of receipts and all that sort of thing, if they can tell that you're organised and on top of things, the likelihood is they're going to wrap up the investigation as quickly as they can. Do get your accountant involved, because they've probably got more experience of tax audits than you or me, but don't expect them to do everything for you, because as I say on mine, I was getting asked a lot of questions that only I could answer as a business owner. And that's why it's not really fair to assume that an accountant is going to handle a tax audit on your behalf. If you have been through a compliance check, let us know in the comments how it went. What sort of questions were you asked? Were they similar to the sort of questions I was asked? Have you got in trouble off HMRC? Have you been fined or anything worse than that? It would be really interesting for you to share your stories with us. But hopefully, from all of this, you've gained an understanding of why we need to keep accounting records and why it's important to have all that information to hand in case you do get a compliance check. Hopefully there'll be very few and far between for your business, but you're a little bit more prepared now. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit subscribe. I shall see you next time. Bye bye.